purpose of anthropology as a discipline. Because probably if you had to name the single greatest contribution that anthropology has made to the academy and maybe to the world, whoa, that was big, it would be the idea of culture. So let's say I'm traveling, used to travel sometimes, maybe get on a plane, the old days. Somebody would say, what do you do? I say, I'm an anthropologist. Oh, you mean dinosaurs? No. Oh, you mean digging up human remains? Well, sometimes some people do that. Oh, you mean archaeology? Well, yeah, we just studied that. That's a part of archaeology. Oh, you mean culture? So culture is something that sometimes people do associate with anthropology. I'm going to claim, though, that culture is kind of boring, or it doesn't make a lot of sense unless you figure out why anthropologists introduced this idea into the world, or the specific idea of culture. The word was already around, but the specific anthropological idea that was introduced into the world. And the reason culture was such an important idea for anthropology and for the world was not because it was so great in and of itself, but of what it sort of was speaking against, or what it was talking against. And so the way I'm going to discuss culture in this class is as an anti-idea or an against idea. And what it was launched against was the idea that our thoughts, behavior, capacities were determined by our race or our biology, which was kind of the prevalent idea at the time that anthropologists started launching this other idea into the world. So to get there, we're probably not going to talk that much about culture itself in this class. We're going to talk about where we were before the idea of culture was introduced. So this is going to get tricky. So the main references for this are going to be Muckle and Gonzalez, the part of the chapter that you read. We'll put those in there a little bit. But there's some other stuff that I'm going to bring in here that's going to be a little bit different. I'm bringing in one of my favorite anthropologists and mentors. His name was Michel Rolph Trouillot, Haitian anthropologist who then worked in the United States at Johns Hopkins in Chicago. And I'm drawing on two of his probably most famous essays, one of them called Anthropology and the Savage Slot, and the other essay called Adieu or Goodbye Culture, A New Duty Arises. And so I'm going to bring in some ideas from Trouillot on the idea or the concept of culture. And then we're going to add in some archaeology, some of the stuff that we've just been talking about, and a decent amount of history. And you might think, well, what are we doing this for? And the reason we're doing this is because what happens in a lot of anthropology classes and textbooks, and it happens in this class too, is you're going along, right? So you're going along in roughly chronological order. You start out and you're doing your human evolution, and you got your primates and they're turning and doing all their human evolution things. And then you have Homo sapiens and they're spreading out all over the world. And then you're doing some archaeology and you're going up. And then all of a sudden you got these ancient civilizations and they're coming along, and you're studying how these empires developed. And then all of a sudden you get to the end of the archaeology unit. And then next chapter, you jump ahead and somebody's eating insects in a bar in Mexico. And you're like, wait, what? You know, we were just in ancient civilizations, maybe doing a little bit of Easter Island, and now we're eating bugs. And yes, it is true that bugs are very nutritious and all those things, and we might need to farm them in order to survive and create a sustainable world. But there's something that kind of goes missing there. And what goes missing is what I'm going to call Muckle-Gonzalez chapter 7.5 or chapter 7.5, which is going to tell us how did we get from, the Inca and the Aztecs and Babylon up to somebody eating bugs, just doing some cultural anthropology in the present. Oh, and by the way, that somebody is Laura Tubelde Gonzalez here. So that's our co-author who's talking about eating insects. It wasn't Muckle, he was doing something else. He probably ate bugs somewhere else. So what happens here? What happens in between archaeology and culture is basically what we're going to do. So this is not a world history class. And so I'm going to sum it up kind of like this, which is for a long, long time, all kinds of stuff was happening. People were trading with each other. They were interacting with each other. There were empires that rose and fell. Civilizations came and went. State societies came and went. People developed cities. Some of them got very big and then they'd go away again. People also were hunting and gathering, developing new hunting techniques. They were transforming their ecosystems in various ways, and the world was doing all kinds of things. In a book called Questioning Collapse, a couple archaeologists summarize what they said would be the most powerful and largest cities in the world at various time periods. And so what they said would be at about 500 AD, or Common Era, if you like that better, about 1,500 years ago, if you looked around the world at the most dynamic and powerful cities, they would be located in what is now Mexico, what is now Italy, and what is now China. If you fast forward another 500 years or to 1,000 years ago, if you want to think about it that way, the most powerful cities in the world would be in what is now Peru, and what is now Iraq, and what is now Central Asia. And then if you fast forward again to a time period at about 500 years ago, the most biggest, coolest places to be if you're into city life would be in China again, in India, and in Turkey. Now, when we think about these places in the world, you might notice that there's some places that are kind of missing from this, which are the cities that we think of as the largest and most powerful cities in the world, say, now. And here's the funny thing is that during this time, during these years, up until about 500 years ago, what was to become London and Paris and all those countries, colonizing countries of Northern Europe, and I guess we could say most of North America as well, that is to say anything north of, say, the Cahokia Mounds, was not really on the world's radar as like a happening place to be. These were sort of these peripheral areas to what was seen as the main developments in what was going on in the world. And so when we think about what has happened over the last 500 years and how a language like English, of all the languages, got to be a dominant language in the world, it's kind of a strange outcome based on what was happening before. So how did this happen, or what was going on that led to this situation? And I'll say that all this time, when we're talking about, say, what anthropology was doing, anthropology doesn't come out until about 100 years ago. So that's what we have to explain here. So I first want to show us, if we go back 500 years, remember the most powerful dynamic cities in the world are in Turkey. That's basically over here, and in India, basically over here, and in China. And so the people in what is now Western, or what is Western and Northern Europe, were trying to get to those places, or trying at least to trade with those places. And the way that they traveled and tried to figure out a way to get to those places was through what was the expansive Islamic empire. So Islam was a very expansionist religion, and it created a humongous and very, in its own way, you might say, progressive empire, in the sense that it conquered all these places all the way out to ruling Sicily, to ruling all of what is the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Spain and Portugal, up into even into southwest France. They were actually stopped at the Pyrenees there. And so a lot of Spain and Portugal were under Muslim rule for quite a long time. And so a lot of the things that, one of the interesting things about the Islamic Empire is it helped to preserve mathematics from the Greeks, various texts, various scientific learnings, and introduce other things into Europe. So when we think about Arabic numerals, for example, those numerals we know so well are actually Arabic numerals. If you've ever tried to multiply Roman numerals, you know that it's pretty darn hard. And so Arabic numerals are crucial to the development of mathematics, and all of the things that we hold dear today was the preservation of the scientific learnings and the development of them by the Islamic Empire. So once again, remember that the Europeans here are trying to get to basically Asia, and they find themselves cut off in terms of getting those old overland routes. There's various developments, political developments. It's getting much more difficult to travel what was the Silk Road. So what happens here is that at the same time, certain parts of Spain and what would become Spain and Portugal are starting to push back the Islamic Empire. And this was later referred to as the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Muslim territory and incorporation into what would be Spain and Portugal. So if you look at a map of the Iberian Peninsula, what is now Portugal and Spain, in 1491, this is what it would look like. And of course, when I say the year 1491, the next thing we're going to think about, because we just had a big blowout holiday to celebrate, is 1492. And if I say that, you'd probably think, well, that's when Columbus turned the world upside down. The truth of the matter is that if you were living in this peninsula in 1491, the most important event in your life would not have been Columbus, who was out wandering around, stumbling on the Caribbean islands, which he thought were in India. And so that's where we get our strange words for things and people. But if you were living here, this 1492 was the year of the fall of the Kingdom of Granada. You can see it down here. Granada was the last Muslim caliphate. Whoa. That was that had control over this territory. And so that was kind of the time in which they were able to expel the Muslims from this territory. And it was also the year that they issued that began the Spanish Inquisition, and so they attempted to expel or convert the Jews as well. And so this is a huge transformation in that certain principalities in Spain and in Portugal were sort of getting revved up, you might say, in order to become more powerful, in order to conquer more places. And so when Columbus stumbles upon the New World, the Americas, he didn't really know what was going on, but by his second voyage, he was very intent on sort of colonizing the place. It led to the establishment of the first transoceanic empires. So before this time, there were state civilizations, empires that had come and gone, but this is the first time that people really establish empires that span the globe. And, sometimes we forget about, for example, there's this little tiny place called Portugal off on, the western edge of Europe that ends up playing a major role in sort of seafaring, establishing various colonies and especially trading posts all throughout, not just the Americas, but Africa, India, and the Far East. And then you have the Spanish, of course, that we probably know a little bit better about their kind of expansion and colonization, even into much of what is now North America, Florida, California, Colorado. Those places all get their names from Spanish explorers and Spanish settlement. And so what we have here is, for the first time, you have Europeans sailing into various parts of the world, establishing these transoceanic empires and encountering a huge diversity of people, more different kinds of people than had necessarily encountered each other. It's not to say that people weren't in contact with each other. Of course they were, and you had people going from west to east and east to west, Marco Polo and all those things. But with these sailing voyages, people come into contact with each other who had in some ways been separate for, maybe for 10,000 years. And so all the things that we spoke about in the archaeology unit, those, hunting and gathering societies and horticulture and agriculture and different kinds of herding societies, and then different kinds of political organizations. The range of diversity is now opened up so that people are communicating and encountering each other in a lot of different ways. And so this is a time that the world is beginning to not necessarily, I guess I would say, yes, become interconnected and begin to trade and interact with each other. They always had been, but across the continents and across the ocean. Now, as we all probably know, you don't have to copy this down. This is the back of a book jacket. I'll just leave it up there. We all probably know that the Spaniards were often looking for gold. They found some gold in the Americas. But what really changed the world in terms of the trade networks and what was going on between Asia and Europe and all throughout the Americas was silver. And this discovery of silver and the mining of silver in the Americas, especially a lot of it came from a place called Potosí. Now, has anybody ever been to Potosí? Does anybody know where it is? It is not in Spain. It cannot be in Spain. It is in what is now Bolivia in South America. You should have guessed it. There it is. Hey, you could have read it. You didn't even have to. Look at that. There, yes. Potosí, if I would have told you, if I would have said this 300 years ago, you'd know, maybe 400 years ago, you'd know exactly where I was talking about. This is a painting of Potosí in 1758. You can already see that it's kind of become an important urban center. There were people from all over the world there because there was all kinds of silver being mined. And so there was, people from, they were using different kinds of slaves and basically enslaved indigenous peoples, but merchants from all over the place were coming. At its time, it was larger than London and Paris. Everybody knew, or I mean, at least, if they didn't know, had the silver from it. It supplied probably half of the world's silver supply, and really injected new life into the trade routes that had previously existed, and enabled the Spaniards to trade with various parts of the world and extract the silver from there. I once did take some students to Bolivia, and we went to Potosí for a couple days. It's a high up in the mountains, very cold, and if you think it's dreary now, it's a dreary, harsh place to live. It has its moments, but it would have been a very difficult place to live, and it it hurt a lot of people to extract this silver as well. Some people say there's various theories for how we got the dollar sign, but one of the best explanations is actually that it was based on the mint sign of the Potosí mint. So it's kind of, again, it's a strange history in which our own currency, or the symbol for our own currency, is actually based on what was called the Spanish peso, but was basically mined in Potosí and was the mint sign of Potosí at the time. So if we fast forward then a couple hundred years, we have the creation of different colonies. So Potosí is here in South America, and also some of the silver mines in what is now Mexico. And one of the things that started to happen is that some of the Northern European countries began settling other parts of the Caribbean and in South America, basically in order to grow sugar. And so this, really revved up the trade, the buying and selling of Africans who were enslaved for the purposes of production, basically, in these new places. And this map is kind of interesting. I'd have you look at it because we have, in the United States, of course, slavery is extremely important to the history of the United States, but we kind of have a strange idea of slavery based on our own experiences with it, in that we typically think about cotton plantations and the South. The United States received a very small portion of the total transatlantic slave trade, less than 10%. Almost 4 million Africans were taken to what is now Brazil, and an equal number into various islands of the Caribbean. And so there are tiny islands in the Caribbean, Jamaica. Well, I mean, Jamaica is a pretty large island, but small places in the Caribbean, we might say, that imported more Africans as slaves than the entire United States. And most of them were transported there for the purposes of trying to grow sugarcane. And so this is a postcard from the 18th century of what is now Haiti. It was known as Saint-Domingue. It was a French colony, and it was sort of the jewel in the crown of the French colonial empire, because it was seen as one of the richest places on earth because of the value of the sugarcane that was produced and the plantations there that were able to ship things back into Europe. And so, I mean, again, it's kind of hard for us to believe now when we think about Haiti and we think about what we know about Haiti. I mean, this was the place to be. This was a place of enormous wealth and enormous, and also of enormous suffering for the people who were forced to labor in these sugarcane plantations. The anthropologist Sidney Mintz has argued that this plantation system was not just the basis for the importation of sugar and calories into Europe, but it also was the basis for the way in which factories eventually in Europe were organized, that the way that the slave plantation had to be organized in order to produce sugar became a template for the later industrial revolution that happened in Europe. So what happens then is that through this colonial encounter, traveling the oceans and putting people together from different parts of the world led to the idea that human variation could be sorted not into kind of gradual variation of skin color, but that people came in these blocks or categories. As one of you noted, when Linnaeus was categorizing the world's peoples, what he did was he put them into 4 varieties. And so the idea, so I think we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the idea of race, is that something like skin color is continuously geographically variable, so that there's no line between the races in terms of our skin color. There's all kinds of, here you can see on the chart, there's how many does he have? 30 different skin color variations. And those are just numbers that are put on a continuous range of variation. So if you were to take a walk from the north down to the south here, there's no line between a village where you walk across and you're like, oh, wait, here I am. Here are I've passed from brown into white, or I've passed from brown into black, or, it would be gradual variation all this way. But when you put people on boats and you sail them into different places and you put them together in different ways, people start to think differently about, hey, wait, whoa, these people are super different from me. And they began to be sorted in part based on this physical variation, but also in part based on what people were supposed to do. So certain people were supposed to be the ruling people, and certain people were supposed to be working, and certain other people were supposed to be the subjects. And so people got categorized physically and by the way in which they were inserted into the global system that was developing of colonialism. So if you take what happens at around the 1860s, this is around the time, say, of the US Civil War, Charles Darwin, some of the things that are happening still before anthropology, what has happened? First of all, as we've talked about, the Spanish empires and the Portuguese empires have transformed the world. And you've had the silver from Potosí has gone into these trade routes and provided vivacity and life to the trade route system that was previously in place, but was kind of expanded upon with these transoceanic empires. After that, you have the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and in Brazil, and they take this thing, azúcar, is actually the Arabic word. That's where we get our word for sugar, azúcar. And it's also that Spanish, but they borrowed it from Arabic for historical reasons that we just talked about. They take this thing that previously was very expensive and only the rich could have, and change it into something that lots of people are eating and lots of people are getting their calories from. And so later on, during the 19th century, during this time, what we call the Industrial Revolution was really built upon these kinds of resources. The laborers in Europe were fed lots and lots of sugar calories and lots of coffee, which came again often from American plantations in the Americas. And so what's kind of funny. That's not really the right word. What's weird about this is that with the process of industrialization, we've forgotten these places and we've forgotten that history. So if we think back, when I say, where's Potosí? You say, I don't know, never heard of it. Did you know that Haiti was once one of the richest places in the world? No, of course not. Right? So we forget of what was going on and we forget how important these other places were to the origins of our own modern life. So what happens is that by the 1860s, the world becomes arranged not just as that people are seeing each other as differently in terms of races, but that the races have a certain hierarchy. That, even when Linnaeus is describing what he considered to be the characteristics of each race, that people could be arranged in a hierarchy with, with white European origin peoples on top and running things and down the line. And so at the time, when people looked out over the world, they saw what was going on. They saw this hierarchy. They saw who was sort of, benefiting from it, who was on top. And they used the idea of racial determinism, coupled with ideas that, environmental determinism, that you're determined by your geography, to explain what was going on in the world, why people were different from each other. They would say, well, it's because there are 4 different varieties of humans. There are 10 different varieties of humans. Or, oh, it's because people in the tropics eat bananas and that's why they behave that way. And what this meant is that the system that was in place was called upon as a justification for the inequalities that had been produced. So that when you looked over the world in the 19th century, you would say, well, yeah, people are in a different situation, but that's because of their, they just don't have the capacities. They don't have the same capacities, or they don't have the same, they don't have the same resources that we do. Well, where did those resources come from? Oh, well, but we forgot about that. So what happens is you get this setup in which the world is arranged in this hierarchical order, and then you use race in order to explain why the world is the way it is and why things are the way they are. Now, like I said, all of this happens before anybody starts calling themselves an anthropologist. Oh, wait. Before I do that, like I said, we got to go back into the second class. And so this is kind of when we think about the 19th century and the ideas that people had, we talked about, how there was this idea of unilinear evolution, that people went from savages through barbarism to the civilized. And so this is somewhere back in your notes. And then in our evolution class, we talked about how people thought that man was at the pinnacle, and that in some ways what evolution did was simply join the links of these previous ideas of the great chain of being so that people were sort of ever more superior. Now, when you put these two things together, you get what we call scientific racism, which is neither scientific, well, it is racist, but it's not really scientific. And what that is the combination of the incorrect evolutionary idea about a hierarchy of man with the ascent from animals, and also the ethnocentric idea that we talked about. And so this is why, when we talked about that ascending arrow from man the hunter up through civilized man, this is why I get so animated about trying to get those ideas out of our heads, because in fact, this is what gave us this idea that, that it was justified to have the world look the way it was, that it was justified to have programs that say tried to breed out bad traits, and eventually led us into the ideas of, you know, of that of basically the ideas of Nazi Germany. And so this is, you know, this is, both of these things are incorrect, but it's a combination of what people felt, or what, you know, Europeans felt at the time, based on the hierarchical world in which it was created. Now, all of this again happens before anyone calls themselves an anthropologist. So when does anthropology come around? So all of this history has happened. This is chapter 7.5, and then anthropology comes out during sort of 1880s, 1890s, 1900, 1910, 1920. And it's during the time in which the Northern European empires have now taken the lead. So we've seen the Spanish and the Portuguese empires kind of rise and in many ways decline at the time. And the other empires of the British, French, and the North Americans began to have more prominence. And so anthropology emerges in various places, but there are three key places. One among the British and also among the French, who had their own empires and basically sent anthropologists to study people in their colonies. And then in the United States, anthropology emerges, first studying people who were known as, because they were misnamed by Christopher Columbus, known as Indians, or now we might say Native Americans, or people that are indigenous to the Americans. So US anthropology starts out studying basically Native Americans, and then becomes, as the American empire expands, you might say, US anthropology has studies all over the place now. So this all happens, like I said, about 100 to 150 years ago, at a time in which the world has been shaped in particular ways, and anthropology is entering the scene as an academic discipline. And so this is where Trouillot's idea of the savage slot comes in. Because what anthropology was sort of sent out to answer was the question that was being posed from Northern Europe and the North America, which is, well, why are other peoples the way they are? Why are these peoples different or strange from us? And so at the time, the most common explanations for why people were different from each other were that of, well, it's their race or their biology. If they're speaking a different language, maybe we can measure their heads and measure their tongues and measure their larynx and figure out why they're speaking a different language. Or it was, you know, well, they live in a snowy area, or they live in the tropics, and so that determines what's going on. And so, like I said, this you know, it was not just that it was race deterministic, it was that, you know, certain races and peoples were better than other peoples, that they could be arranged in a hierarchy. And so anthropology enters into this. Anthropologists were part of this. Some anthropologists contributed to these ideas. But eventually, through the study of biological anthropology, the study of archaeology, and the study of cultural anthropology, eventually we say, no, that's not why people are different. It's not racial determinism. When we think about why people are different, it's because of culture. And so if you think about the way the world was at the time and what people thought about other people, this idea was a pretty revolutionary idea because it overturned the common ideas, or it sought to overturn these common ideas that were also justifications for the world that was. And so it took a while for anthropology to do this because anthropologists were from the colonizing, empire-building countries. And they basically were the ones who were sent out or wanted to study people who were outside of the European and North American experience. So, this is how we get that, some people are like, well, what's the difference between sociology and anthropology? Well, today there may not be a huge difference, but back in the day, basically the sociologists were supposed to study Europeans or North Americans, or, economists were supposed to study the economies of various European nations. Political science was supposed to study the politics of these nations. And anthropologists got everybody else, you might say. So, we're sent out to do all these other studies. Now, the concept of culture is, like I said, in itself, it's probably, I don't want to say boring, but it's, it's pretty simple to grasp, I think. There's two parts to it. First part is that human behavior has patterns, that we don't just have randomness, that it's not just every individual off doing their own thing summed up. And so what we have is, if we look at different societies and different groups within a society, what we have is we see patterns in how people think. We see patterns in how they behave. And we see patterns in how we make things, or what Muckle and Gonzalez say, what we have. So how we think, how we act, and what we have. And so a lot of the things that we think about and how we act become, we try to create stuff that goes along with our ideas. And so there's what we call material culture. We've sort of been studying that in archaeology, which helps us to realize, or helps us to fulfill the ideas we have about how we should behave and be in the world. And so when we look around the world, we see not just a collection of individuals, or we see that people have different languages, so different ways of organizing their thoughts, different kinds of ideas about, who should be married to whom and how people should trade with each other. All of these things are part of the patterning of culture. The second part of culture is that those patterns are learned, that we learn how to do these things. We're not born doing these things. Some of them we learn in this place called school, but for the most part, we just soak it up from growing up in any society. So that means that they are not determined by the natural world, or the world outside of us. That means it's not determined by our biology. Now, again, that's not to say that human biology isn't important and biological differences aren't important. Of course they are, and we've talked about how biological differences are important, but it's not going to determine our capacity for culture, or our abilities, or what kind of culture we're going to absorb. It's also not determined by our geography, or the dreariness of the climate, or the amount of sunshine that we get. I mean, these things are important, of course. Sometimes having a sunnier climate can help people be sunnier, but it's not going to determine the kind of cultural ideas or cultural behaviors that are in a particular place. And we can see this when we look at places that are in similar geographies, similar latitudes, and might have extremely different ideas about the world. We learn culture through a process that Muckle and Gonzalez call enculturation. And I mentioned it here. This is at the end of our the reading for today. We'll talk more about, basically our next class will be a lot more about this process of enculturation, or how we actually learn culture. But culture is what's important about enculturation is that culture is passed along through sharing different ideas, through socially transmitting ideas, either from one generation to the next, or among the members of your peers. We often learn from each other, and we share ideas across a social system. Culture is connected to our capacity as humans to use symbols to understand our world and interpret it, so that, well, it's what we're doing right now. So this is more than marks on the board. We can actually communicate about ideas using symbolic representation. So that if I hold up a white flag, it doesn't just mean that I'm waving a t-shirt around. It might mean something like giving up or surrender. So these, different kinds of symbols take on meaning in human life. It happens with some degree of human consciousness. And I say some degree because some of things in culture we think about, and other things are sort of beneath the surface. They're more difficult to think about, or they seem natural to us, and so we don't think about them so much. But we certainly do, if it's called to our attention, think about culture. And what that means is, we don't want culture to itself become this kind of deterministic thing where, we just say, instead of saying people are different because of their race, we say, well, they're different because of their culture, that's their culture. There's a few things that we will always want to keep in mind. One is there's always going to be, within any cultural formation, there's going to be heterogeneity, or not everyone is going to think the same thing, in part because we have this social transmission. People think about things, people think differently about things, and so you're always going to see variation within any culture. Culture is also always changing, always going to be dynamic as it's being passed along from generation to generation, or even within the same generation, it's going to be changing and modifying, and it's not going to be set for all times and all places. And there are not, sometimes we can point to cultural units, or what we might call cultural groups, but remember, people are always in interaction with each other. And so a lot of the things that we think of as from our culture are shared across different kinds of cultures. And so, it's oftentimes very difficult to draw a boundary around one particular culture and say, well, this is where one particular culture begins and this is where another one ends. And so I bring those up just to kind of make sure that culture in anthropological terms is how we become human. We become human in a particular way, and it's what accounts for our differences that we see in the world. We don't necessarily, though, want to say that this is a new form of determinism that would be like the racial or biological determinism which culture was meant to replace. And so when early anthropologists, and this is a picture of Ruth Benedict, who wrote in the 1930s in the United States, saw anthropology not simply as a scientific endeavor, and it was a study or a scientific endeavor, but it was also something that was launched into the world in order to help people understand that being different from each other wasn't necessarily something to be feared or exterminated or, or despised. One of you talked about the idea of ethnocentrism. And so, like I said, at the time anthropology first emerges, we have a very hierarchized, a hierarchical world arranged by the idea of race and arranged in a way that people thought of racial determinism as, the explanation for why people are the way they are. And so introducing this new idea or new concept of culture was, at its time, was a quite revolutionary idea. In today's world, we say culture all the time, but at the time, back 100 years ago, this was seen as something quite radical. And so some of the early anthropologists were kind of these seen as fairly renegade or rebellious types who had a very different explanation for why people are the way they are. And that's basically what we'll be exploring in this unit, is the different ways in which people organize themselves and how to understand that outside of our usual interpretations. Comments?